Thank you. The gentleman's time has ended, and I will take the opportunity to question now and appreciate the panel for being here. This is an open hearing with a great opportunity. I would quickly add that I appreciate the fact of having a rural mail carrier that services my home and services is not only with the mail, but in many human ways that add I think, some real special additional effects to what a mail carrier can do. And I appreciate the work that's involved there. I also have a daughter who lives in a third world country and works there. And I know for a fact that her mother and I are unable to send her mail with anything of value in it, knowing that it probably won't reach her. We don't worry about that in the United States. So I applaud you for that, and I thank you for the service that you provide. But we also have to understand that we've got to make it work for the taxpayer, too. And I appreciate the efforts, and that's why these hearings are being undertaken. I received a letter just recently from a constituent in my district that operates a family-owned mail transportation business and employs 45 people in doing that business. His business performs services at a fraction of the cost of USPS employees, and this tentative contract, which insources 600 highway contract routes, could negatively impact upon his small business. Mr. Miller, as you rightfully stated in your testimony, using contractors helps lower the USPS costs. Can you quantify how much contracting saves USPS overall, and explain how the tentative agreement with the APWU that insources at least 4,000 jobs will help attain fiscal responsibility?
Mr. Chairman, I would be glad to do that in writing. I haven't those numbers on the top of my head. On the second part of your question, there was some give and take in this agreement. We gave a few things the unions, the APWU wanted. We took things, and they took some things that we asked for. As I think the Postmaster General has described this morning, and if not, we'll send you some additional information, the unions have to compete for this insourced work. They have to demonstrate that they will provide it at least the same cost that we could go outside and get it. I think it's very important that we be a—
That's the same cost at this point in time, but not dynamically.
The same cost could be contracted for at whatever point that it might be.
But the concern that, as we look at the budget dynamically in the future, that indeed can be a low cost put in now, taking these jobs away without the incentive in the future because of the contracting situation we have.
Mr. Chairman, you're absolutely right, and we have to be very careful the way we execute that provision. But you put your finger on something, and that is the importance of our being able to continue contracting out, and contracting out in some areas where the service is now provided by postal employees. This is a way of our lowering cost and keeping a restraint on labor, wage, and benefit demands. And I will come back to a point that in response to Congressman Mica's raising about the sale of assets and about relocation, et cetera. We have been very troubled, the Postmaster General, the previous Postmaster General, the Board of Governors, by the propensity of Congress to put riders on appropriations preventing our doing these things. And that's one reason we haven't done as much as we might have. And if there could be a moratorium, it's like a moratorium on earmarks, there could be a moratorium on these riders, I think we could move more swiftly and more effectively and efficiently in the areas that Congressman Mica identified, and the area that you're identifying, that's contracting out.
Well, that's certainly worth looking at and part of the process. But let me just jump here quickly in the few remaining seconds. We've talked about contracts. Well, what would a good contract look like to you, Mr. Miller? And then I want to jump over to Mr. Donahoe.
A contract would be one in which the service provided would be at least as good as what we are accustomed to having, and the price would be lower than what we're paying now.
Mr. Donahoe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have 30,000 contracts in the United States Postal Service. So we contract everything from using FedEx's planes, where they're the largest customer, all the way down to a number of mom-and-pop contracts like you talked about. We take every one of those contracts very seriously. What we looked at in this negotiation with the APW as far as bringing some work back in was our ability to absorb work into the existing framework. The flexibility that we got in truck schedules allows us to schedule people in a much different way than we had in the past. We used to schedule 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. The new schedules give us a lot more flexibility. I can absorb in the 8-hour time frame smaller contracts with HCR, and saves me bottom line money without adding on any people, at the same time absorbing those costs. That's what we've looked at. We have embraced process management in this organization across the board, and we have rooted out numerous costs and identified these opportunities, and that's what we pursue. The other thing that's important, we did not give up any ability to outsource. As a matter of fact, the APWU has asked that they are able to compete on a same basis with any outsourcings going forward, and I welcome Mr. Guffey to come in with those proposals.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Donahoe.
Thank you.
My time has expired. We'll move on to Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I thank the witnesses for your help. You know, the Postal Service goes into every American business and every American home 6 days a week. And I think if there was any illustration of the value of having a public system, having the current postal system, it occurred on and after September 11th. Most people know I have an extraordinary number of people in my family that work for the Postal Service. My aunts and cousins, my uncles, my mom, my 2 sisters who are still there. My mom's a retiree. But going back to September 11th, which was the day I was elected in the primary, and after that, we had attacks on the Postal Service, anthrax attacks. And down here at the Brentwood facility, we lost 2 brave postal workers from inhalation of anthrax. And I remember talking to some of the local union leaders with the American postal workers and the letter carriers and my mail handlers and supervisors and the postmasters, and they were very concerned about going to work, because in many of these facilities, many of these plants, you had the risk of anthrax. And so the question was posed to the union leadership at the APWU and National Association of Letter Carriers and the mail handlers. They said, should we send our people into work? Should we send them into work when we know that there's, especially with the Brentwood example, there's lethal danger there? And it was a very precarious time, because we in government were afraid that if the mail did not get delivered to every American home and business, that the economy would seize up. This is when President Bush was saying, get out there and try to stimulate the economy. Well, if the American postal worker had not gone to work, it would have seized up our economy. And I think it was a very proud moment that the union leaders at the Postal Service asked their members to go into work. And I know my sisters had, one of my sisters had 2 young kids at the time, and I know that was a vexing situation for the union leadership and the workers themselves. But God bless them that they went to work and they kept the mail being delivered, and we got through that tough spot. But with all this talk of privatization, I wonder how that would have gone if those were private employees for some contractor. Do they make the same commitment to deliver the mails in a tough situation? Do they handle the security and the special responsibility that they have with respect to our nation, as do the postal employees? And I think it's remarkable, as one of my colleagues noted, that for the 6th consecutive year, postal workers are again rated. I think it's the Pew poll. The Pew Foundation does a polling on the popularity or the reliability of Federal employees in all employees in regard to the American people, and they continue to rate the postal workers the highest 6 years in a row. But we're talking today, at least in one part, about going to 5-day delivery. And I'm wondering if that's just one way of, if the Postal Service isn't going to deliver on Saturday, then who is? And I think there'll be a private entity that will want to take up that space. Mr. Donahoe, you have any thoughts on that about losing market share for the post office by considering going to 5-day delivery?
Well, thank you first, Congressman Lynch, about the excellent comments about our employees. They do a great job. We're very proud of them. And even this winter, up your way, that mail got through every day in really trying conditions. The Saturday issue is an issue we've wrestled around with, and it's been a concern. The big concern we have is that there is a changing marketplace, and the first-class volume that we've lost over the last few years has really pressed us in terms of revenue per delivery, and that's why we've looked at making these changes. The one thing we would do in this process would keep our post offices open so you could still come in and buy stamps. If you needed to get mail, we'll have post office boxes open. We'll be able to do that. And, of course, we'd still be delivering things like express mail. As we examine the demand for mail going forward, it does press us on some of those choices. We've looked at things like asking the American public to move their mailbox. We've done some surveys in that area. People say they don't want that. We've talked about changing service standards to save us some money there. We've got some feedback there that wouldn't work, and of course we hear about the post offices. So it's an ongoing process. We continue to look at that, but as we've laid out in our comprehensive plan, we think that just the nature of the changing demand for mail would force us to move to a 5-day delivery schedule.
Thank you. I see my time has expired. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now recognize the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Ross of Florida, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, I thank you all for being here. You know, I take very seriously, as you all do, the issue of the pre-funding of the health care and the pension. And assuming that we are able to address that, because I believe it's something that we need to address. Mr. Donohue, it doesn't necessarily, though, resolve the long-term issues of the United States Postal Service, does it?
No, it doesn't.
I mean, we still have to make some systemic changes.
Absolutely.
We still have to address workers' compensation.
We have to address that, absolutely.
Overcapacity.
And we're doing that.
Underperforming facilities.
Yep.
And labor costs.
Yep.
So while we're able to identify that there's a big issue out there, the bigger issue is really the systemic changes we need to make to the Postal Service for the long-term viability.
And that's what we've laid out in our comprehensive plan, and this agreement with the APWU from one union helps us to get in that direction.
Now, you and I have been able to meet several times, and I appreciate not only you and your staff for the cooperation you've given me and my understanding for my subcommittee responsibilities. We discussed a pay-for-performance plan that has been in existence for about 10 years with managers and supervisors, I guess, about 65,000 of them. Could you just briefly describe how that's worked?
We have established a pay-for-performance plan in the Postal Service. To your point, we have 65,000 people. That's postmasters, that's supervisors, that's administrative people, all of the non-bargaining employees in that. What we do yearly is set goals. We've got national goals on service, on finances, and on people, a balanced scorecard, and we also have individual goals at a unit level. We have constructed a process that all 65,000 people have an individual rating, and that's how they're compensated. It's strictly a pay-for-performance system. We have no COLA. We have no step increase. All of our managers in this organization are compensated on pay-for-performance.
And what has been in your experience with those managers? Do they like it?
They like it. It's competitive. They are on that website all the time seeing how they do, and it has produced tremendously good benefits for the Postal Service and, more importantly, for our customers.
Now, translating that mindset to the collective bargaining negotiations that you have, has this type of pay-for-performance ever been introduced or discussed in a collective bargaining situation?
Mr. Guffey and I have had some discussions, and we talked about going forward in that area. The changes that we have been able to effect with this negotiation are the most we've ever seen. The fact that we have been able to change flexibility, and long-term pay structure indicates that there is a willingness for the APW to really take into effect our customers and our business going forward.
But never was put on the bargaining table a pay-for-performance plan, was there?
Well, we had some discussions, but like some of the other things, it's a give and take, and I certainly—
And Mr. Guffey, I mean, you mentioned in your remarks that, of course, if the economy were to get better, then that would change things. But in fact, it's much more than the economy. I mean, if it were just the economy always being the driving force, we may still be riding around in horse-drawn carriages or having mail delivered by bicycles. But it really has to do with market changes, with technology. And is it not true, then, that in order to adapt, the United States Postal Service and its employees have to adapt to changing trends in the market, not only the Internet, but technology as a whole?
It's true that there are some Americans who will never use the Postal Service again, but they're not required to pay for it because the Postal Service does not receive one dime of taxpayer money. It's everything, the benefits, the wages, the buildings, everything is paid for by postage. And while the market, there's individuals in the market who will use the Postal Service.
But it's more than just the economy. In 2006, we had a good economy, and yet first-class mail started declining significantly.
But we could rebound from the decline in first-class mail if we didn't have the $5 billion weight put upon the Postal Service.
But it's more than that. I mean, let's be honest. It's a lot more than that. And let me ask you this now. How do you feel about this agreement?
We're both going to be honest?
Sir?
I'm going to try.
I'll ask the questions.
Okay.
Thank you. Now, how do you feel about this agreement?
I feel like the agreement was a give and take. I think the agreement, we gave some flexibility in exchange for the security of our people for various things. A lot of talk has been about the no layoff clause.
And you told your employees it's a pretty good deal, didn't you?
I have told my people exactly what it is.
And you think it's an excellent deal, so much so that you're going to pay your members to vote, are you not?
I'm not paying anybody to vote.
You're not paying your members? Have you looked at your website where it says, to encourage participation in the contract ratification process, APW President Cliff Guffey is encouraging locals to get out the vote.
I do.
The National Union will reward the locals that are most successful in mobilizing members to vote, with the top 3 locals in each of several categories receiving monetary compensation to be used on behalf of the local members. So you're buying their vote, are you not?
They can vote no.
And if
every one of them votes no, they vote no.
In addition to buying their vote, are you not also using it as a membership drive?
It's an affront to say I'm buying people's vote.
I
realize that's common practice on your side of the table, but it's not with mine.
Does your website not offer compensation to vote?
It offers people to encourage people to vote. It offers encourages the locals to vote, not one way or the other.
The Chair would suggest that neither side get into rationale behind somebody's intention, and I would expect that on both sides of this debate. And I appreciate that you're both very interested in getting it right, but I would make that caution. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman, Mr. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me thank all of the witnesses for being here with us. These are obviously difficult and complex issues and serious problems. I've always been told that there are no simple solutions to complex problems. Governor Giuliani, do I understand, and did I understand you to suggest that if we did not have to pre-fund the retiree benefits for the Postal Service, if they did not have to pre-fund those benefits, and although we thought we were putting in some good provisions in the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act, that instead of a deficit, we'd be talking about profits in terms of the Postal Service?
My statement was over the last 4 years, that would be true, Congressman.
What would be the downsides to not having that requirement? If that requirement was not present,
I don't believe there is any downside. We are funding on an annual basis to the excess of $2 billion health care benefits for our employees. We have been paying them, we continue to pay for them. Private corporations do not have to pre-fund retiree health care benefits. They have to account for them on their balance sheet. It's not a cash output. And in fact, because that's such a burden, in 1992, I may not have the year right, but in the early 90s, there was an accounting rule change that said companies had the option, a one-time option, to cap forever retiree health care benefits. Because if they couldn't do that, if they didn't do that, they would have an unbounded liability on their balance sheets, and there'd be no way to be able to tell whether they were a going concern. Most corporations in this country took that option and capped them in 1992. And whether you retired in 1980, 2000, or 2040, the company has no more responsibility for those health care benefits than what the cap was in 1992.
And while this would obviously not solve the problem in terms of our long-range conditions, but it would be movement, and we would not be standing still. We would be moving.
It would be significant progress. We've made progress with the $3.8 billion in this union negotiation, $5.4 billion payment per year would make a significant progress. We also need to move forward with 6 to 5. We also need to stop overpaying for FERS. These are the drivers. There's lots of changes that need to be made. They're all comprehended in our plan. We've considered all these things. We've offered what we believe to be the most rational choices. We don't want to have to do 6 to 5, but considering all the alternatives, when we polled the American people, when we took our surveys, when we had outside experts look at that, they said, out of all the alternatives, raising prices, changing delivery standards, and a whole bunch of others, this was the least painful. This was the best we could do.
Mr. Donahoe and Mr. Guffey, let me commend both of you on the tentative contract that has been negotiated. I think that it is one of the most positive labor management movements that I've seen in a long time. And I know that there are efforts on the parts of some people in our country to diminish the role of unions, who have fear, but it seems to me that you struck an accord that suggested that both sides understood that it was not a win-lose situation, but it's a win-win situation for the American public. And I think that's where we have to go. So how would both of you comment briefly relative to being able to reach that agreement?
You want to go first?
Just real quickly, I think American labor and industry has to come together and work together to bring back industry and commerce to this country. And I hope this is a step to show other people that it can happen.
I would agree with Mr. Guffey. We have great employees in this organization, and they want to do a great job for the American public. And I think that as we sat down and talked through things that we needed from a Postal Service perspective for flexibility and cost benefits going forward, we were able to achieve that. And Mr. Guffey was able to achieve what he needed for his employees, and it was a win-win. And it is a very good thing for the American public and our customers.
I commend you both and yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. We now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. DeJarle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'd like to just take a few minutes and maybe put some things in perspective. We're facing a tough battle this week on the budget, and certainly the country right now is hurting in many ways, and people are scrambling to cover themselves and make sure that financially they can be as stable as possible. We go back to districts with high unemployments, 9% across the country. Several counties in my district are upward to 20%. And times are certainly tough, and I sympathize with everyone. According to committee calculations, the average employee cost for USPS is $89,845 per year, or close to $45 per hour in benefits.
Is the total compensation averaging out more than $80,000 per postal employee per year, including wages and all benefits, including retire health benefits, Mr. Donahoe?
Yes, I'd have to double-check those numbers, and I'd get back with you on that. But the way we calculate our costs, it is wages and full benefits, including retirement.
Okay. So if that's true, then the average work hour for a USPS employee that's publicly reported is about $40 per hour?
We consider a fully loaded hour right around there, yes.
Okay. Do you think that's generally a fair amount in terms of trying to keep the Postal Service running when you're doing these negotiations, talking to employees? Nobody wants to give up anything. It's hard to take things away from people once they have them. But is that as low as people are willing to go to keep their jobs?
I think that, again, to the point we've been making, when we went into this negotiation, our goal, 3 goals. We were looking for immediate financial relief, we were looking for flexibility, and we were looking for long-term structural change, and we achieved those. We've got a substantial change in the way that we will be compensating non-career employees, and that pulls that loaded factor down significant by 53%. The other thing, of course, is the 10% differential going forward. That also will pull those down. We realize the labor costs are high, and as we've worked with the APWU, they understand where we were coming from. The other thing that's important is we also have real opportunity with the flexibility that we've negotiated in there, so that if you have a full-time employee, they can now work between 30 and 48 hours a week, which is very different than we've had in the past. So, Doctor, we are looking at every possible way to provide great service in an efficient and effective way.
Okay. Can you speak just briefly to the graph that's behind us here, the private sector versus Postal Service?
I can see that. It would be interesting to see the numbers, but it almost looks like the blue line starts going up when we began to pre-fund employee health benefits. That's the first thing that I see. We have been it's critical to understand that the Postal Service has focused not only on total labor costs in terms of wages, but we have focused on headcount. We've reduced headcount in this organization by 30% since the year 2000. That's legacy costs.
Thank you. Mr. Guffey, when I go back home and talk to my folks, it has been mentioned that the Postal Service doesn't cost the taxpayer a dime. What's going to happen if you default on September 30th? Who does that burden shift to?
I believe Mr. Miller said it would be a miracle for these things to happen. And, I think Congress can work together and resolve the problems of our country and the Post Office. And I think that's what America wants you to do right now. I think they want their post offices in rural Tennessee. I think they want to have their mail delivered. I think they want this sort of thing.
Let me just interject. You had mentioned earlier that you employ 100,000+ veterans, which I think is great. That's fantastic. What do we say to the active military personnel whose wages are far less than what we're talking about here in the $40 per hour?
Well, I'm not sure if you take the weighted average of about the military benefits that are involved with their retirement and their health benefits, which are all provided by the government too. If you put it all together, I'm not sure their package would not be the same. I'm just saying that, yes, we would like to have good jobs for these people to have when they do come home. Talking about the custodial jobs, they were maybe priced a little higher than they should be, but they were jobs that were reserved for the veterans, so the veterans could come home to these good jobs.
Well, when you're talking about concerns about your employees losing their pensions and their benefits, what do we say to the private sector who faces losing Social Security and Medicare benefits?
Well, I think they only face the losing of Social Security and Medicare because of the economy, and that our jobs, like say hundreds of thousands of jobs are now overseas. Trillions and trillions of dollars of American money is overseas right now, as opposed to being working in this economy and lifting up this next generation to where they pay, and you broaden your tax base so you can afford Social Security and Medicare for these people. That's the real problem in this country right now, not the fact that public workers are making too much.
You don't think the government spends too much? You don't think there's ways?
There's a lot of things I think that the government spends money that they shouldn't be spending on. Like I said, this hearing is costing more right now in tax dollars than what the Postal Service is getting out of tax dollars this year.
And that's a big part of the problem, and that's what we're here to solve.
I thank the gentleman. The Chair would note that the graph that was on the screen does not include the pre-funding. That's a pay-as-you-go cost. And I appreciate the gentleman who, by the way, I think we're both on salary. So I'm pretty sure that whether we show up here for a hearing or not, the cost is substantially the same. The Chair now recognizes the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Tierney, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chair for that, and I thank all the members of our panel. First, let me say that I think that the way that you collaboratively work towards a tentative agreement is to be commended. I think that's what the collective bargaining process is all about. And it seems to me, from listening to your testimony and reading it here today, that everybody made concessions, which is, in essence, what the American people expect out of public service employees and employers when they go to these negotiations. They want everybody to be reasonable. And I also seem to think that there look to be downsides for both of you if you decided to push the button and go on to arbitration. And I think that was a trigger to getting things done here. So I think that that's at least a positive that we can take out of this, and knowing that there were constraints seen by management under what they perceived to be some legal constraints. And I think the union's obviously under constraints of not wanting to risk going to arbitration and coming down with far less than what you got. But I want to talk about, I'll leave to the testimony that was already given and the questions asked about the pension and retirement contributions and how much that would go towards solving the issue that you have here. When we had a hearing back on April 15th of 2010, John Potter, who was then the Postmaster General, was one of our witnesses on that. And I asked him a little bit about the privatization and what would be the cost to the American citizens if the thing was privatized. And he talked, and I'm going to just synopsis a little bit here. He talked about the fact that it's fair to expect that you wouldn't get mail necessarily delivered to your doorstep. Prices, in all likelihood, would significantly go up, that not all areas would, in fact, be served. These would all be, so universal service would be threatened. So these would all be decisions that management could then make on that. I then wondered whether or not there wasn't some price tag, that what we got in terms of universal service and a large retail distribution situation and 6-day mail and all of those things that we get for having this type of service as opposed to a privatized service, if somebody hadn't put a value to that. And Mr. Potter said, we put a price tag on that of about $4 billion. And then he said, smaller, now in today's dollars, it's like $4.5 billion on that basis. Do you gentlemen agree with that?
That's the, when the Postal Service was first formed back in the early 70s, there was a universal service option that we could have asked for continued appropriation to actually cover our universal service. And if you look forward with the value of money going up through inflation, it would turn out to be about that amount.
Okay. Well, I wondered why we hadn't gone forward, but Mr. Potter then said that they ended up in very poor condition in the late 60s because of the difficulty in getting the appropriations, and they were reluctant to ask for it.
That's our issue has always been one of a self-sustaining entity. If the government does not pass the budget this week, the mail will still get delivered. We have been self-sustaining. What we have been asking for is for Congress to act on these mandates around the pre-funding requirements, the 6 to 5 day and the first. As I've said before, we get those resolved, we know that we will be a viable, ongoing business. We still provide excellent service for the American public. That's the help we need from Congress.
But, you look at it another way, though. It's like people, I think people by and large want the services they're getting, the universal service, the 6-day mail, and all those things on that basis. So you have a customer out there that owes you about $4.5 billion a year that you're not collecting. I don't know what kind of a business decision, a management decision that is. Mr. Guffey, do you have a comment on that?
Well, it would be nice and refreshing to see that the money was coming from the government to the Postal Service instead of just from the Postal Service to the government.
Mr. Donohue, you're smiling at that, but I mean, you do have a customer out there that we put a value of $4.5 billion in the services that you rendered to them without ever collecting a dollar for it.
Well, the reason I'm smiling is because we have some other bills that have been owed over the years, and sometimes they don't get paid. So we would like the Congress to feel that the Postal Service can stand on its own and do a great job for the American public without any kind of appropriation. Well, that's what we're asking for.
Okay. All right. So I guess
no
all the
taxpayer
semantics,
money.
if you look at it as an appropriation or you can look at it as paying value for what you're getting in return. So you've decided, I guess, that it's not worth the political hassle to ask the American people to pay $4.5 billion a year for the service they're getting It's much easier to try to run starting with $4.5 billion in the hole and try to build around that.
Here's the thing. We have paid into the retiree health benefits $43 billion. What we would love Congress to do is to take a look and see that $43 billion, along with what the Chairman mentioned, our ongoing payments, we think when you go ahead with a 400,000-person postal service going forward, we're already covered with that. So we don't want any money. We want no taxpayer money. We just want Congress to remove that burden that we're being forced to pay. First, I owe $6.9 billion, or you owe $6.9 billion back to me in first overpayments. I got a bill last week from the OPM increasing my premiums. I mean, I'm already overpaying. Just give us treat us fairly. We will do a good job for you.
Well, I already co-sponsored that bill, so let's see if we can do the rest of them. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Brawley.
I assume you're referring to Mr. Braley, Mr. Chairman?
I'm sorry. I apologize.
Oh,
I know better.
No need to apologize. I'm one of those people who thinks in order to know where you're going, you have to know where you've come from. And I think it's interesting to note that on July 26 of 1775, the Second Continental Congress appointed Benjamin Franklin as the Postmaster General at an annual salary of a whopping $1,000. And Mr. Donahoe, I'm sure a lot of colonists thought that he was grossly overpaid for that work, but we all know how important it was in the evolution of this country. In 1808, the Select Committee on Post Office and Post Roads was established by the House of Representatives, and it was the beginning of a surface transportation program that has benefited this country ever since. One of my wife's grandfathers was a first-generation American whose father came from Germany, and he left to go back to fight the Kaiser in World War I, the world to end all wars, came back and became a letter carrier in Dubuque, Iowa, and became president of his letter carriers local. And when they started renovating the White House under the Truman administration, the people he worked with thought so much of him, they spent the whopping sum of $2 to get some of the timber from the White House to make a gavel for him that I am fortunate to have in my possession. When my father left the small rural community in Iowa that he lived in to go to Iwo Jima at the age of 18, he got letters from his mother that I am thrilled to have in my possession, that only got to him halfway around the world because of the hard work and efforts of men and women in the Postal Service and postal delivery system. That's why I love letter carriers and postal workers. My dad came back and became a substitute rural letter carrier. And I know from growing up in a small town that that postal delivery service was often a lifeline that got you much-needed services that you needed to do your work and to function in society. But I'm very impressed with the fact, as the ranking member of the Veterans Affairs Economic Development Committee, that unlike many Federal agencies, the Postal Service has done an extraordinary job of employing veterans. And you brought this up in your testimony, Mr. Guffey. And here at a time when returning Iraq and Afghanistan veterans have an alarming unemployment rate of 22%, I'm trying to figure out why my friends on the other side of the aisle want to add to our unemployment problem by firing veterans, by firing women, and firing minorities who make up a large percentage of the Postal Service workforce. That's a question we all need to be concerned about. Some of my colleagues have argued that a union would never lay off a hardworking veteran postal worker. We know that's not true. We know that it happens because that's the way the Postal Service has had to make tough decisions. We also know that if we're going to fire middle-class American veterans that work for the Post Office, it's not going to fix our budget crisis. And that's why we have to fix this problem with pre-funding, because we know that it is the low-hanging fruit. It is the most clear, obvious opportunity we have to make an impact, and that's what we should be focused on. According to two independent offices in an OIG report, the Civil Service Retirement Service is overfunded by $50 to $75 billion, and the Post Office's FERS program is overfunded by $6.9 billion. We should let the Post Office transfer that budget surplus to fund their future health care obligations and make sure at the same time that we're doing everything to promote efficiency. And Mr. Donahoe, I remember when my daughter graduated from high school 5 years ago, And I was thrilled to find out that I could get customized stamps of her and her friends to give them as graduation gifts that they were thrilled to receive. So we know there's been a lot of innovation going on at the Postal Service to try to address these market pressures, to modernize, and to come up with new revenue streams. Can you give us some examples of what other things the Postal Service is looking at, like that stamp program?
Sure, I'd like to. One of the things that we've been focusing on from a revenue perspective is simplicity and making sure that we can really grow the business-to-consumer channel, especially for small business. So we've just introduced a new product out there called Every Door Direct, and the idea is that in a very simple way, if you're a small business, you can reach within a couple zip codes everybody that lives there. We're also conducting Grow Your Business Days right now at thousands of post offices across the country all summer long, teaching people how to use eBay, Amazon to grow their small business. Congressman Mica showed me before he got that email on his BlackBerry. One of the products we're working on right now is the opportunity to show you what's coming in your mailbox today. We have that technology. We have that as a product going forward. So we know that we can do things for small business. We can also do things for people who like to have a little bit of digital in their products too.
Thank you. My time has expired. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Mica.
Well, first of all, Mr. Guffey, I'd have to take great exception with your comments on this is some sort of assault on labor, whether it's in Wisconsin or in or this hearing. Mr. Guffey, do you know what the financial differences between the states and the federal government is?
The big difference, and there is not a whole lot of difference, the American taxpayers pay the cost for both.
Yeah, but
and you have to have taxpayers employed to pay the taxes so the payroll can be done.
That's true, and we've spent the last several years paying people not to work, rewarding failure and penalizing success, and we've been great keeping the unemployment up about 10%. Not to mention other areas that are 20 and 30%. The big difference is that the federal government, we just keep printing the money. If you go out the door here and go down the end and go out on Independence, you can almost hear those presses going day and night printing funny money. We've indebted this country $5.3 trillion in, what, 24, 30 months. We're borrowing. So the big difference is that the states have to have a balanced budget. We're printing the money, okay? So the states, you call this an assault on labor, but they're making tough decisions dealing with their biggest cost factor, which is their employee base. And it's not pleasant for anybody. This is not a hearing that's intended to do an assault on labor. Do you know how much we're borrowing for every dollar we're spending, Mr. Guffey?
Way too much. The economy
should be here. About 42 to 43 cents per dollar we're borrowing, most of it from foreign sources. This is not an assault on labor. You know, I'm in the transportation area. We used to have we kept firemen on trains, even though we didn't use coal or anything. We had to fire for many years. We had conductors and cabooses, even though we had adopted electronic means of communicating with the train workmen. You're aware that it wasn't an assault on labor when we had to eliminate some of those positions. Would you say that was an assault on labor?
Well, when you use 70-year-old examples, I don't think that I can't relate to some of those 70-year-old examples.
Well, again, okay, let's use a modern example. They're telling me they can run the post office with 400,000 people, and I have 572,000. I've got to make some changes. Is it just make work? I mean, more and more is going over this. They're even going to this. When they go to this, they'll need fewer than the 400,000.
You can order your medicines over that, but you cannot get them delivered to your home.
Well,
the mail volume is going to change.
True.
The type of mail is going to change.
That's true, and that's why I usually use FedEx or UPS. But this is no affront. I love postal people. George Coleman was my postman for 17 years. He went on to be the mayor of DeBary. My postman who came to our home in upstate New York wrote me a birthday card till the year he died. I can't think of people I like better than some of the postal workers I know.
We try.
But this is not an assault on them. This is a change in the whole dynamics of communication in our society. And we've stopped feeding. We can't feed dinosaurs. We can't afford to do that. So again, Ben Franklin, was a postmaster in 1775, appointed by. In 1775, it was interesting. Ben actually arranged to have mail delivered from Philadelphia to New York in same-day service. Did you know that?
Yes, but he did it as the King's representing postmaster, not as the United States postmaster.
Yes, I know, but he could still do it, and even though he had the position, I think his son had the position, they could deliver the mail with same-day service, which we still can't do today in the United States. But what you have to do is adapt, and the post office is becoming a dinosaur and will soon be extinct if it doesn't adapt.
And we're working very hard to adapt with the Postal Service.
The money tree in the backyard died, and we've got to find a better way to deal with a $6 billion, and your $15 billion credit limit or whatever it is about to run out, and there's no more coming from here. Thank you. I yield.
I thank the gentleman.
Yield back.
We now go to the gentleman, Mr. Yarmouth, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony. And I'm glad that Mr. Mica brought up UPS and FedEx. I have a very special interest in this hearing because I happen to represent the district, which is the home of the global hub of UPS, and UPS is our largest single employer. And I'm also an honorary member of the Letter Carriers Union and very proud of that. So I have multiple interests. And Mr. Mica said he likes to rely on UPS and FedEx, and I'm glad he relies on UPS. But I went back and checked, and the least you can spend to mail anything or deliver anything with UPS is $5.17, and the lowest price you can deliver that FedEx will deliver anything for is $7.22. Mr. Donahoe, what do you think would be the impact on American business, charities, local governments, utility companies, and so forth, if for every piece of mail they had to send out, it would cost $5.17?
We wouldn't be talking about 1 day fewer delivery. We'd be probably talking 1 day a week. It would be dramatic. Now, we're very proud of the fact that we have been able to hold our postage rates down at 44 cents. And we are also very proud of the fact that we provide excellent package services for businesses, too. We work well with FedEx and UPS. We deliver a lot of their packages.
Okay. This relates to the question Mr. Tierney asked a while back, and he talked about the $4 billion plus subsidy, essentially, that goes to users of the Postal Service. How would you break down the users of the Postal Service? What percentage of them are commercial enterprises? Which percentage of them would be private individuals sending individual personal correspondence?
It's probably close to 95% of the mail that comes into the system is mailed by a commercial entity. The customer business the mail that goes between residences today is a lot smaller. You know what? Let me take that back. It's probably 90% because there's about 10% of customers still use the Postal Service to pay their bills. So me paying a bill or me sending you a card, that represents about 10% of the volume.
So essentially what we're talking about here, whether it's $6 billion or $3 billion or whatever it amounts to a year, forgetting the argument about FERS and the prepayment of retirement benefits, we're talking about an enormous subsidy to American business.
I would not say it in those terms because I think that the American customers enjoy getting what's in their mailbox. It's a great way for people to advertise. It's a great way for people to correspond, even if it's just to say, hey, check my website out. We feel that the Postal Service is very important for the American economy, the bill payment side, bill presentment. So it's an excellent platform for all users in this country.
I don't disagree at all about those statements, but the fact remains that if all of those businesses who were sending advertising, and I was in the advertising business as a publisher at one point, also took advantage of the break given to publications. But they are sending those advertisements, those solicitations, and they're billing mailings as well at a rate that is far lower than they could get anywhere in the private sector in a free market situation.
Yes, but again, what we've been asking for in terms of the mandates that Congress has got with us on the retiree health benefits, we think that there's a resolution around those without having any effect on our customers.
I understand. You could continue to offer that very low rate, and I'm very proud of that. I don't want my time to expire. I mean, when we talk about, the great Republican Lincoln said the legitimate role of government is to do for the people what they can't do for themselves, and essentially I extend that to mean the private sector can't do. And the private sector can't deliver a piece of mail for 44 cents across the country, around the globe.
Probably not.
Probably not. One question, quickly, Mr. Guffey, on the issue of retirement benefits, and this has disturbed me a great deal in light of what's happened in Wisconsin and Ohio and Indiana. The notion that somehow these are overly generous benefits when we are asking police officers, firefighters, mail carriers, and the like to embark upon a career which requires a great deal of physical exertion, and to have basically a shortened career as opposed to something they might otherwise do. And part of the trade-off, part of the way you get people to embark upon those jobs is to guarantee that there is a healthy retirement for them. Otherwise, you would have police officers, if there weren't a healthy retirement, police officers at 75 years old chasing criminals, and 75-year-olds delivering the mail, and 80-year-olds climbing into buildings. I mean, isn't that part of the consideration here in order to get people to do some of these public service jobs, or quasi-public service jobs in your case?
I think that is a great consideration, but there's also a pride and knowledge of serving America. I'm from that era of John F. Kennedy, see what you can do for your country. I went to Vietnam. I tried to serve the country in the Postal Service. And my retirement, I take home like $1,600 a month, and out of that, and I pay my health insurance $300, or about $250, something like that, out of my own health insurance, my part of the payment. So it's not a huge retirement by any means, but it's a satisfactory life of serving your country and your fellow Americans.
Thank you for that answer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. We now recognize the younger of two near-identical twins here and present today. I tell you apart mostly by your ties, both of which are stunning, but your father, I think, edged you out a little on the ties. Mr. Clay.
Thank you so much. I'll have to catch up with him on my haberdashery. Let me applaud Mr. Guffey for the comprehensive and thoughtful testimony you submitted to this committee for today's hearing. I think it shows a serious commitment that the APWU has to work in partnership with the U.S. Postal Service to address the challenges that it currently faces. And I stand firmly in support with working with our families in the postal unions, and I am committed to supporting the Postal Service's reorganization to meet the challenges of today and tomorrow. However, I am very concerned with some of the elements of this hearing. This Congress in 1970, through the Postal Reform Act, took action in essence, to take politics out of the Postal Service, and also gave workers collective bargaining rights. I'm afraid that some here today are seeking to return politics back to the Postal Service and perhaps strip those rights. This committee certainly has a welcomed responsibility to perform oversight duties for the Postal Service, and I don't think anyone would question that. I think many here, like you, want to see the Postal Service succeed. The service that USPS so admirably and consistently provides personifies the best of America. What's disturbing is that some want to use this hearing to attack something else that best personifies America, workers' rights, and the freedom that comes with collective bargaining. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope that we're here today to help the Postal Service and its workers find the right path to sustainability and success. I don't think that involves getting in the middle of the collective bargaining process, and I don't see how that helps. Mr. Guffey, your testimony demonstrates quite clearly that the Postal Service labor force has made some remarkable gains in productivity in the last few years. In fact, the workforce has been reduced by close to 120,000 employees since 2008 to 572,000 employees. This represents a 27% reduction since 2000. Total costs have also been reduced by $11 billion since 2009, including a reduction of $4 billion in labor costs. Mr. Donahue, you also mentioned in your written statement that the Post Office has achieved record service and productivity levels in recent years. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And yet, on the wage side of the equation, Mr. Guffey, you testified that since 1970, there has been only a fairly modest increase in straight-time wages in real terms. Do you agree with that?
That's correct.
And Mr. Donahue, do you agree with that analysis?
Yes, our employees have done a great job from a productivity standpoint, and they have enjoyed raises that have tracked fairly close to the rate of inflation.
And wouldn't you say that the Postal Service has gotten a pretty good deal out of their employees over the years?
I think the American public has gotten a very good deal from the Postal Service and the employees. They're very dedicated. They've done a great job from a standpoint of productivity and service.
I thank you. I thank you both for your response. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I certainly think that you do have to keep pace on the haberdashery side. You know, you have a haberdashery history with President Truman, and you know, and that alone as a Missourian is critical.
Yeah, we do have something in common. We're from the same state.
I thank you. We now recognize the gentleman from Vermont for 5 minutes, Mr. Welch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for their excellent testimony. My view, this is a practical problem to be solved. I don't see that we should be coming at this trying to take away wages and benefits, and I don't see that it should be attacked by trying to take away delivery services that Americans have really come to rely on. I'm from a rural state in Vermont, and I don't know how the letters, we had a lot of snow this year. I mean, we had a lot of snow this year. We had 10 feet of snow. In fact, it's snowing now. And somehow, some way, on my 8-mile dirt road, you managed to deliver the mail. So I don't know who's responsible for that, but it wasn't you guys. I can tell that. It was those people in these little post offices back in Heartland, Vermont, Norwich, Vermont, it's quite astonishing. So there's been I don't know, festive atmosphere here, talking about what's good and bad, but the bottom line is the mail's getting delivered. The other thing that's quite amazing is you're doing it on these snow days for 44 cents a first-class piece of mail. That's a pretty good deal. And it's business, and it's those personal letters that we don't get as many of, but we all love to receive. And the other thing that is amazing, and I think it's just got to be acknowledged, it gets sort of swept aside when we get in these discussions, is that the things that the commercial deliverers don't want to provide to deliver, you guys do. And a lot of times it's frustrating when we go to our mailbox and there's more, quote, junk in there than we want, but it is a part of commercial life in this country. So I think those have to be acknowledged when we're trying to wrestle with this problem. The other thing, you pointed out that you've had about a 30% head count, 100,000 fewer employees since '08. You know, Governor Miller, that's an amazing thing. You know, we sit up here on these dais and act as though it's time to change because it's a new era, and it's true that we have to change, but that is hard. I mean, these are livelihoods. People have built their lives around a system that we put in place in a way that made sense, and then not just individual employees, but businesses, homeowners. I mean, I think that's a significant accomplishment that demonstrates real good faith. I mean, what are your views on that?
I agree with you. I agree with you, Congressman. It's a remarkable achievement. It's something that has been done in a compassionate way. Most of it has been done done by attrition. Some have been reassigned, but it's a remarkable achievement. The unfortunate thing is that the volume of mail has contracted faster when you consider the productivity increases than we've been able to keep up with.
Right, and that's the new world that we're in. So further adjustments have to be made. But my sense here is that no one's easing off on the gas pedal and trying to make these changes. I mean, would you agree with that?
Yes, sir, I would, and I think Postmaster General Donahoe's done a great job. He was in charge of this as Deputy Postmaster General, and I'm sure that Governor Giuliano or Chairman Giuliano would agree with that. Might have something to add.
Well, thanks. No, that's all right. Let me go on to another one. You know, one of the issues here is, do we go to a 5-day delivery to save money? And I understand there's some debate about how much, quote, money that we would save. But let me ask this question. I'll ask you, Mr. Donohue. What would be the impact on losing market share to your competitors if we went to a 5-day week?
FedEx and UPS don't deliver on Saturday now. So we don't think that there would be much of a change. We think that, again, customers have the opportunity, if they'd like with the Postal Service, to have a post office box to get their mail in, and we still would be offering express mail service. So Saturday's our lightest day. It's the day that from an advertising mail standpoint, that's the lightest day of the week where advertisers try to hit a mailbox, because generally people are out and about on Saturday. Monday through Friday they come home, they look at their mail, and then they do their shopping on the weekend.
Mr. Guffey, how about you? What's your sense on that? I know that on Saturday I have more time on my hands. And I mean, the Saturday delivery is something
I hate to see
I
hate to see any service cut to the American people unless it's absolutely necessary. There are other means of it would create you know, a situation where private companies, mailbox, et cetera, and these places that provide their own boxes would not receive the mail, which is good for us, because then the people who have those would have to come get post-off boxes if they wanted them on Saturday. But you know, I hate to see any services cut to the American people when there's opportunities to keep providing those services.
Okay. And Chairman Giuliano, you've been talking, as we all have, about the first overpayment of contribution, right?
Correct.
I mean, this is an amazing situation. You can be over-aggressive or too passive, and it seems like we're making you front money beyond what actuarially, by any standard, should be required. Is that more or less the case?
That's my understanding. And Congressman, there's a pattern behind this. This is not new. In 2003, it was determined that CSRS was overfunded by, I can't remember what the number was, but it's over $50 billion.
So what's the problem of changing that?
We're told by OMB and Treasury that it takes a change in the law.
And that's it?
Well,
so, Mr. Chairman, we can help solve this problem. We change that law. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman, and I trust that in the President's budget, somewhere hidden, I didn't see it, he had considered that, but like I say, I missed that. We'll now see the gentlelady from New York for 5 minutes. Ms. Muller.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to ask the Postmaster General, Mr. Donohue, questions on the wage rates in comparison to competitors. And I know that some of your private sector competitors are non-union, but it is also my understanding that the wage rates of the Postal Service are roughly equivalent to the private sector competitors. And as the Postal Magazine study showed, that Postal Service letter carriers start at $15.85 an hour, while the starting pay for a UPS driver and a FedEx carrier are roughly $16 and $14 respectively. And I'd like to ask you, does the fact that the USPS is required by statute to deliver universal service and to do a 6-day-a-week drive-up, that their compensation costs put them possibly at a competitive disadvantage, but actually compared to the Postal Magazine, you're very competitive. In fact, you're lower than one of your major competitors. So I'd like your comments on that, Mr. Donohue.
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman Maloney. We do realize that we have a competitive rate of pay, and that's something very important to us. As we've sat down and negotiated with the APW, the key thing for us was to achieve some short-term financial benefit from the contract, as well as increased flexibility and some workforce structure going forward, and we were able to do those. Labor costs do drive costs in this organization because we are such a labor-intensive organization. I think that we've worked very well with this union to come up with some good solutions going forward to reduce costs and help keep the Postal Service viable for the American public.
Thank you. And as the majority has pointed out repeatedly, 80% of the Postal Service's operating costs are related to workforce compensation. But just so that we are clear on this point, I am informed that less than two-thirds of that 80% is for compensation of the Postal Service's unionized workforce. Is that correct?
That's true.
So the unionized workforce of the Postal Service accounts for roughly 50% of the operating costs, not 80%, as some would imply. Is that correct?
In any business, you're going to have wages. We've got wages that generally, wages and benefits make up about 70% of our costs. We have another 10% of our costs, roughly 9.1%. We pre-fund retiree health benefits. The other 20% cover transportation, supply services, fuel, like any other company.
Well, I think that it's important that we are clear about the actual labor costs represented by the unionized workforce, and you have helped us do that. And I'd like to open it up to the other members of the panel to comment on this issue, if you would, please.
Clearly, our bargaining unit only represents about 30% of the cost. I think about 29% of the cost.
Mm-hmm. Other comments?
Congressman Maloney, I would just comment that we think that the percentage of cost is not the issue. It's how the total cost relates to our financial position. We think that today's tentative agreement that we're talking about makes good steps to reducing those labor costs in a fair way while maintaining flexibility in using that workforce.
And Governor Miller?
Congresswoman, I think, number one, we have to look at every opportunity for the Postal Service to reduce cost, given our dire financial straits. Secondly, I would think that it would be, frankly, whether we were in dire financial straits or not, it would be irresponsible for us not to look at cost at every opportunity for a contract negotiation.
Well, my time has expired. Thank you very much.
I thank the gentlelady, and we'll now go into a second round. double-check to make sure that no one else came in. Okay. I want to tidy up a few things. The gentlelady from New York talked about unionized workforce. Mr. Donahoe, it doesn't matter whether your labor is unionized or not, does it? If it's 80%, it's 80%, right?
It represents 70% of our total cost, yes, sir. The other 10% is in the retiree health benefit cost.
Right. Well, but she actually said unionized workforce, which confused me a little because you have plenty of non-union workers because they're management and they are represented by associations.
Yes, sir.
Secondly, I think there was a lot of dialogue back and forth, and I want to set one thing clear from the center of the dais. This is not about the hardworking men and women of the Post Office. This hearing is not even about the union negotiations per se. Our committee's primary jurisdiction in the area of concern is the Post Office right-sized for the future? And one of our concerns, one of my concerns, goes to this, and Governor Miller, maybe you can help me with this. In the union negotiation, they negotiated a no layoff. Now, the problem is if we go from 6 days to 5 days and you score a savings of 60,000 workers and you can't lay off workers, how do you get the savings?
Well, Mr. Chairman, first, the no layoff provision was an extension of the previous contract.
No, I understand, but just narrowly, you can't score a savings if you can't get rid of the people, especially when you already have 100,000 too many today. I've asked my staff to look at a lot of areas that we may legislate, which would include, and for the Postmaster General, I know you're looking for legislation. I've got to tell you, what we probably need to do is bite the bullet one time and figure out how we're going to retire people that are over 55 and have over 20 years of service to help get your number down. Voluntary departures aren't working. The fact is you have less than 1%, or slightly more than 1%. You have the lowest attrition. Any private company would love to have the attrition you have. Basically, I mean, you still have 2 people that are 98 years old on the payroll. I mean, people don't retire, do they, Mr. Donahoe?
They do retire, Mr. Chairman. We have reduced the headcount in this organization by about 215,000 since the year.
But today you're carrying over 100,000, almost 200,000 more people than you would need if you started the organization. No, wait a second. Hear me out. If you started the organization to do the job that you currently need to do, you built the facilities you needed, and you hired the workforce you needed, you would need between 170 and 200,000 less people. You're shaking your head no. Governor Miller, if you built from the ground up, you'd need a lot less people, wouldn't you?
Right. You're right, Mr. Chairman, and you're right on the basic principle, but I will defend, as I understand it, Pat can correct me if I'm wrong, but the $3.8 billion estimate includes the problems of diminishing the numbers. So under this contract, because business is contracting, you don't realize all the flexibility benefits right away. But your point is correct if you think about it, and that is if you're going to be contracting very fast, how do you bring down the number of employees as rapidly as you
Okay. Well, I've got 2 more things in short time remaining. Mr. Guffey, you said you have a $1,600 retirement. Now, that's your retirement basically from your military service, right?
No.
That is your Postal Service retirement?
That's my Postal Service retirement.
Okay. Do you have any other entitlement coming now or in the future from your service to the Post Office?
No.
So that's it. Okay. We want to make sure we understood that. I've got a chart I want to put up very briefly because this is the crux of one of our challenges. All of you have been talking about pre-funding and overfunding. When you look at that chart through 2016, which is the end of the pre-funding period, it is higher and then it drops down. You all see that. I want us to understand that every year you don't pre-fund between now and 2017, you have to add it back on in the later years. So one of the challenges I'm looking at is if we were to abate today all your pre-funding from now till 2017, although you would drop down, in 2017 we'd be looking for $9 or $10 billion and every year going up. So one of the challenges is even if we were to smooth it out, unless we were to forgive essentially what you're going to have to pay, essentially you're lowering it now, you're going to be raising it then. Does anyone disagree with that?
Yes, because that chart includes a track that would result in substantial overfunding of the account.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask one exit question here. Chairman, you talked in terms of private corporations, and you've been very good on it, so I want to hold you to it. Are you willing to do what they did in 1992, have Congress statutorily tell you that if we're not going to stand behind the pensions, whatever you pay in, you pay in? Because if what you're asking to do is to not pre-fund, and you want to sort of be there where 1992 made it, those private corporations, and I believe including United Airlines, who stuck the American people in their bankruptcy, and others, basically they limited their contribution, and a default meant that the retirees got less. If you don't, as you call it, pre-fund, and then the Post Office continues to drop off to where it's not able to pay in the amount because it simply would be too big a burden to have postal carrying make sense, wouldn't we ultimately end up with a Federal responsibility? In other words, today you're saying you don't want to, you call it pre-fund, we call it fully fund on our side of the aisle. If you don't pay in now, and we were to say, you know what, we'll give you the abatement, but we'll tie it to the default being a default that doesn't pay out, how would the letter carriers and others feel if what we said was, you know, because you don't want to pay it in, we'll do that, but then we won't stand behind it with full faith of the American people? How would they feel there?
I don't know how they feel, but let me.
Oh, you know how they'd feel, don't you, Chairman?
No, yes, I know.
You'll hear, if you'll hear, unless you say, I know they wouldn't like that.
I know they would not like that, but there's some confusion here, Mr. Chairman. I would like to straighten out, in all honesty. You're referring to funding pensions, fully funding pensions.
Well, but we were talking health care, but you used the analysis of the pensions earlier on.
No.
And health care.
No, the 1992 date, and 1990 might not be the exact year, but close to that.
It's when General Motors had this huge hit one time and locked it.
That was, yes, right. It was a book hit. It was a balance sheet hit. It was not a cash hit. They chose to determine what the liability levels were going to be for retiree health care benefits, not pensions. Pensions are governed by a whole different set of pension accounting rules, which for most public companies only require 80% funding based upon the actuarial needs.
And that's where I came up with what happened in the case of United Airlines and others. The fundamental question, my time has long expired, but the fundamental question I think that we're going to leave unanswered, but anyone can respond for the record is, isn't it true that if we don't fully fund by some way, I'm not overfund, but fully fund, that we leave the taxpayers of America on the hook should the Post Office not be able to pay in the future?
We are paying, we are fully funding. The Postal Service is fully funded for pensions and overfunded for pensions, both FERS and CSRS, and overfunded for retiree health care benefits. All we're saying is, as I said in my statement, we're more than willing to continue paying. Of that $7.9 billion in 2011, that's 5.5 plus 2 plus some other $1 billion that we are paying to make sure that we're fully funding the retiree health care benefits on the actuarial needs. What we're concerned about and what we're asking for fairness and a level playing field is the $5.5 billion that came across in the 2006 PAEA that on an accelerated basis required us to pre-fund. That's what nobody else has to do. We want to stand behind these responsibilities. We have been. We think we can.
And I appreciate that. I apologize, but I really have exceeded my time. Mr. Cummings?
Let me ask you this, Mr. Donahoe. You are not asking to eliminate pre-funding, but to pay your retiree health benefits over on a true cost basis and spread it over 30 to 40 years versus tackling the liability in 10 years. Is that accurate?
What we're looking to do is get a true accounting of exactly what we owe. We would not shirk our responsibility. When we talk about 400,000 employees, that would include a Postal Service that delivers mail 5 days a week, that has a substantial number of non-career employees that would be not adding on to that liability, and then we could recalculate everything that we've got going forward. That's what we need to do, because until we do that, you don't really have an idea of exactly what's owed.
Let me say this to you, Mr. Donahoe. I, too, join my colleagues in applauding you for, and I say this very, very seriously, for hiring Ron Stroman. He did an outstanding job for us. We're sorry to see him leave. He helped us through our transition. He was absolutely magnificent. And that means a lot to us to know that he's there, and we really do appreciate that.
We agree with you. We're very happy to have him.
One of the things that I wanted, as both sides of the aisle have said that this is not an attack on postal employees, and it's not. I don't want one single postal employee. I have some in my family, and I know how hard they work. Mr. Guffey, I understand, I really do understand your emotion. You don't have to apologize for that, because you're representing some people who have already given a lot. They've given a lot. I think anybody who looks at the fact that 100,000 people, 100,000 people, that's a lot of people, since 2008 are no longer working for the Post Office. That's 100,000 families. I sat, Mr. Guffey, on the Joint Economic Committee. And you know something very interesting that I've noticed is that when the employment rate is 8.8 for the nation, it's 15 point something for African Americans. And the Hispanic rate is close behind. And then, so when you tell me, Mr. Donahoe, that we've got 40% minorities, that's very, very significant. I want to see the unemployment rate come down also, just like all of us do. And when I hear about women, many of them, I'm sure, single head of households, struggling every day, trying to make it. Many of them have lost their jobs. When we talk about these loss of jobs, I don't want it to just be like collateral damage. And then we're talking about veterans. Until I got deeply involved in it, I didn't know the Post Office hired this many veterans and took care of the disabled veterans and gave them some dignity, instead of having them, as I see them in the AMVET Center in my district, many times unable to find jobs and whatever. All of that is very important. And it would be, I cannot walk out of this room without telling you all that I'm proud of the negotiations that you've been involved in. And Governor Miller, I thank you for what you said. I know you have some differing opinions here and there, but you said several things. You said we're a collegial body, but you said something else that is so significant. You said, I really believe that Mr. Donahoe is doing a great job. And that's what it's all about. And what I'm saying to you is that sometimes, one of the things I try to do with my kids is I try to be careful that I just don't say the negative when they do something wrong. I try to make sure I compliment them for doing something right. And sometimes I get a little bit upset that we don't root for the home team, for the team that is doing it right. And you said something to me, Mr. Donahoe, yesterday that I hope you don't mind me sharing. You said that if all the unions worked with you like Mr. Guffey's union worked with you, we could solve all kinds of problems. And so I just, again, Mr. Guffey, the reason why I'm talking about this is because I know that there are people, your employees who are sitting there saying, we're going to get 10%, new people saying, we're going to get 10% less. I know they're sitting there saying, we're not going to get a raise for 2 years. They're sitting there saying, You know, a lot of our colleagues have already gone for whatever reasons. But I want them to know that a grateful Congress appreciates what they do every day. When I look at my mailman in the rain and snow, and although I was kidding a little bit, I'm serious, seeing dogs run after him, I don't know how many members of this Congress would walk up and down steps in the hot sun, delivering mail. And in many instances, going through all kinds of difficult circumstances. In my neighborhood, I live in the inner city of Baltimore, you may not even find a mailbox. They can't even find the mailbox to put the mail in. But some kind of way they do it over and over and over and over again. They get up and they do it. And I think that we need to take a time out and applaud them for what they do. And I know that public employees are catching hell from all levels and being constantly told that they're not doing this, not doing that. But the fact is that they're doing a lot of wonderful, great things. And again, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing, and may God bless you.
I thank the ranking member. I'd like to thank the witnesses for their testimony. In closing, I'd like to echo what the ranking member just said. This hearing has said in no uncertain terms, hardworking men and women of the Post Office, not just this particular union that we contract we talked about, but all of the workers. I think on both sides of the aisle, we've talked in terms of how do we get to a fair pay-in for the various future obligations of the Post Office, and in fact, how do we get to the right number of postal workers. I think we can all be proud on both sides of the aisle. This has not been about any kind of cheap shots on the Post Office postal workers who have dramatically improved their productivity, whose rating by the American people continues to be high for customer satisfaction, but simply a matter of how do we get to the right number and the right recognition of obligations now and in the future to meet a mandate that this Congress has voted for and reiterated repeatedly when it came to the self-sufficiency of the Post Office. The ranking member and I take very seriously our unique obligation to oversee the Post Office and to, in fact, bring such laws as may be necessary to incorporate that. In closing, we did talk about one particular piece of legislation. I believe that both the Republicans and Democrats here are going to have to work on a number of pieces of legislation in order to help the Post Office control its own destiny, free up the Post Office to enter markets appropriately, and most importantly, to get to the right number. I can't from the dais, and I know the ranking member would share this with me, we can't tell you what the right number to pay in is. We can't tell you whether the Administration's refusal to look at FERS is appropriate or not. But this committee will hold hearings. We will reach out to the experts to try to find those right numbers. And if those numbers need to be adjusted, you have my assurance, and I believe you will have the assurance of every member on this committee, that we will work for those right numbers regardless of the scoring or other technical hurdles, because we do want the independence of the Post Office to be about your taking responsibility for your costs and us staying out of your way. So once again, I thank you. You have had many questions unanswered. I would invite you to use the next 7 days to revise and extend in any way you see fit, and they will, without objection, all be included in the record. We stand adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Cummings.
Thank you, Mr. Cummings.